SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, warm greetings of the day. This is Dr. Bhanupriya Rohila from the Department of English, Mohanlal Sukhadia University, Udaipur. In this class, we are going to discuss the Romantic era or the period of Romantic revival. The topic is a part of the paper titled British Romantic Literature, prescribed by the UGC CBCS syllabus of English Honours. The lecture is divided into the following parts. The first part is the introduction. The introduction consists of the historical and political backdrop of the contemporary Europe, which would help us understand how it was changing the psyche of the society and of the writers. The second in line is the impact of the socio-political revolutions. The third is about the differences between the neoclassical and the Romantic era. The next in line is what is Romantic revival or romanticism along with the pre-Romantic literature. It will be followed by the beginning of the Romantic era and lyrical ballads. Thereafter, the major writers of the era and their contribution will be discussed, and finally, there will be the conclusion. So let us begin with the introduction. The period starting from around late 18th century to the early 19th century is marked with great and irrevocable cultural and attitudinal changes in Europe. The paradigmatic shift in the overall sensibility of the people was brought about by several forces. Industrial revolution had recently made its mark in England, and the whole course of the European economy was influenced by it. Industrialization made England technologically well equipped, but at the same time, it increased the problems of urbanization and the class disparities in society. The working classes were being exploited, and they were struggling to make their ends meet. Simultaneously, France also underwent the French Revolution, which proved to be a turning point in the modern history. The increasing rift between social classes and uneven distribution of wealth and power had created unrest among the French masses. The absolutism of monarchy, which was unable to handle the situation, amplified the turbulence. Thus, Europe witnessed a sea change in the economic and socio-political spheres, majorly due to the French Revolution and Industrial Revolution. And besides these, the Napoleonic Wars, the Social Reform Bill after the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence, and the likes, all together impacted it greatly. It is the reason why the period is known as the Age of Revolution. These revolutions, especially the French Revolution, established the ideas of liberalism and advocated the ideals of free will and individualism. So before we begin with Romanticism, let us take a brief about the French Revolution to understand its fundamentals. The French Revolution started in 1789 and continued till 1799. It was a revolution for republic and was against monarchy. Politically, the revolution brought an end to the monarchical system and transferred the power to the citizens of France by making it a republic. After the revolution, the French were empowered with the right to vote. At the social level, the abolition of feudalism brought about a marked change in the life of common people. And at the religious level, the sovereignty of the Catholic Church was questioned and the political power was taken away from them. Thus, so many radical events took place during this period. As a protest against the social inequality and the oppression and exploitation of the common masses, the revolution endorsed the ideas of individualism and liberty. The philosophers and visionaries like Voltaire and Rousseau played a significant role in spreading these ideas. It started with a more humanistic approach, and liberty, equality, and fraternity became its motto. The influence of these ideas was not limited to France alone, but rather, it impacted the whole of the Europe greatly. Thus, similar to its geographical reach, its ideological and conceptual reach was also not limited or confined to the spheres of politics and economy, but in the fields of art, literature, and music also, the fundamental principles of French Revolution engendered a marked change, which later came to be signified with what we know as Romanticism. Europeans were greatly influenced with this revolution, and it had impacted the psyche of the general masses so deeply that it could be easily witnessed in their lifestyle also. Change became the buzzword of the time. Thus, amidst the social and political upheavals, the technological innovations and the overall changes that Europe underwent that time, it can be said that from the literary perspective, Romanticism was a reaction against the growing rationalization, classicism, and rigidity of normativity, industrialization, urbanization, and the aristocratic social and political classes. The movement was taken as a call to return to nature, that is, the Mother Nature, and to the countryside. In content and the manner of expression, Romantic literature revolted against the neoclassicism of the previous century that was considered to be very mechanical and rule-bound. Hence, in response to the constrained neoclassicism, the writers of this new era, with the changed standpoints, looked back to the ideals for art and beauty of the medieval era or the Middle Ages. which were influenced by the ancient Greek and Roman writers. So, aestheticism was central to the Romantic era, and the change from the established rules was what they supported. The word romanticism has its roots in the French word romance, which became popular in the Middle Ages. In Old French, it denoted a courtly romance in verse or narrative. Adventures of knights, chivalry, passions, and love were the main themes of the time. And the same became inspiration for the Romantic writers too. And therefore, the Romantic writings are also known as the Romantic Revival for their heroic, emotional, imaginative, and passionate themes. It is interesting to note that the Romantic writers were not designated with the term Romantics in their own time, and the period was defined primarily by its liberalism. It was late in time that the writings of these writers collectively came to be known as Romanticism. It was an artistic, intellectual, and cultural revolution. Another interesting fact was that the British Romantic ideals also had a deep impact of Germany. German writers like Goethe in poetry and Schiller in drama had been excelling in the time, and the philosophers like Kant and Schelling had introduced the philosophy of transcendentalism to the world. The German thoughts, especially this philosophy by Kant, fascinated the British and American writers to a great extent. The transcendental philosophy rejected the materialistic interpretation of the universe and held that reality was a spiritual essence that transcends sense or sensory experience. The British Romantic writers like Coleridge and De Quincey were greatly influenced by this philosophy. Now, let us understand how Romanticism was different from the era that preceded it. The Neoclassical Age, also known as the Age of Enlightenment, existed between the late 17th century and 18th century. This is also known as the Augustan Age, since the writers of this era tried to revive the ideals of the ancient classical Greeks and Romans like Virgil and Horace, who lived under the regime of King Augustus. In this era, the writers majorly focused on the rules and technicalities of writing. Their proclivities included constraint in expression, and their writings showed seriousness in subject and themes. The era which is called the Romantic Revival formally begins from 1790s. The Romantics also revived the romances of the Middle Ages as originated by the Greek and Roman writers, but the perspective of these writers, the Romantic writers, was different from the Neoclassics, and they focused on the ideals of beauty and art mainly. The English Romantics also tried to revive the Romanticism as found in the Elizabethan era, which was discarded by the Neoclassics since they considered Elizabethan practices to be crude and irregular. The Romantic writers tried to unshackle poetry from the bounds of the neoclassical rigidity. For the neoclassicals, the subject matter of the poetry should be rational and should contain truth of the world, the worldly wisdom and the sayings of the wise men in the past. So they disapproved of any impulses or emotions or passions in poetry as they are not appropriate for nobility according to them. Whereas the Romantic writers, they supported imagination and enthusiasm as the fitting manner for poetry. They, unlike their predecessors, experimented a lot with language of poetry, meter, and style. And most importantly, their content and focus were markedly different. The neoclassicals embellished their poetry with elegance and sophistication in style of writing. And for doing this, they confined themselves to the regular and smooth meters, which was mostly the closed couplet. Their language strictly followed the poetic custom of the time, and they believed that one should manifest their poetic skills within the limits of such rules and the set poetic diction. On the other hand, the Romantics believed that such rules and bounds were quite unnecessary, and poetry should reflect the genuine emotions of heart with spontaneous utterances and not just the embellishment of thoughts. So, according to them, the poet should be free to follow his own discretion in the use of language and versification. There was a basic difference in the two eras as to the role of the poet and functions of poetry too. For neoclassics, the poet and poetry were means to focus on man as the subject of art, but man and art both were pragmatic and an object of value. Whereas for the Romantics, poet and poetry were the means to focus on man in nature and man as man. This led to a more humanistic approach towards life and literature. For the neoclassics, art was more useful intellectually than emotionally. Whereas, on the other hand, for the Romantics, it was primarily emotional fluidity. The key terms that describe the Romantic writings are emotion over intellect, imagination, freedom, love for art and beauty, nature worshipping, and spontaneity. Whereas the terms that define neoclassical era were logic, wit, reason over emotions, technical precision, decorum, accuracy, rationality, objectivity, etc. The neoclassical era, though emphasized upon the value of universal harmony, but it was emotionally constrained and restricted, whereas the Romanticism advocated individualism and liberalism. Therefore, again, it was more humanistic in its approach. So the major genres of neoclassical era were essays, parodies, letters, satires, burlesque, which were most popular during those times. In poetry, the themes and the tones were mostly didactic and the popular verse form was heroic couplet, as discussed earlier. However, in the Romantic era, novels and essays were also the popular genres, but poetry surpassed them, and the writers revived lyrics, ballads, and odes in which the tones were simpler and largely individualistic. The neoclassicals reflected conservatism in almost all the spheres, and thus the subject matter was limited to the historical or mythological events of ancient Greek and Roman cultures and other classical themes. Whereas among the Romantics, the exotic and Oriental subject matters were very common and popular. The medieval ballads, Celtic chivalry, and legends, mysterious East, and other remote and afar things. Remote not just in space, but also in time. That is, the longing and yearning for past were the popular themes among them. With a great impact of Restoration and Puritanism, the neoclassicals believed that the human beings are primarily imperfect, sinful, and flawed. And therefore, they focused more on precision, rules, and order in everything. Contrary to it, away from the existing industrialization, the Romantic writers wrote about the solitary life amidst hills, mountains, or woods, and had an immense interest in the folk and rustic life that liberated them not just emotionally but spiritually too. Thus, this distinction between the two ages is often marked as artificial or elaborate versus natural or simple. The major writers of neoclassical era were Alexander Pope, John Dryden, Jonathan Swift, Addison, Steele, and so many others. And the major Romantic writers we will discuss here shortly. Now, let us discuss how it started in the field of literature. On philosophical grounds, it was Rousseau who had contributed greatly in ushering in the new perspective against the neoclassical rigidity. He advocated freedom in expression and found the middle-class lifestyle and nature virtuous. Influenced by the thinkers like Rousseau, in literature too, the change was widespread. And many had already started rejecting the artificiality of neoclassical expressions. So, the transition period that follows the neoclassical era is also known as the age of sensibility. This is the time wherein the seeds of romanticism are found. It started sometime in the middle of the 18th century and continued till 1798. The cult of sensibility was found primarily in the novels. But gradually, in poetry and in other genres too, this cult started making its mark. In poetry, alongside the cult of natural and picturesque landscape poetry, the cult of melancholy also started and found its place in the poems of graveyard poets. Similarly, a great interest in Gothic themes in narratives also went up. The old forms of poetry poetry revived and became popular, and these altogether gave impetus to individualism in literary expression. The sentimental novels gave thrust to human sentiments in literature against reason and logic, and the Gothic novels like Horace Walpole's Castle of Otranto and Matthew George Lewis' The Monk, and many others like these, they revived the interest in the supernatural and mysterious elements much prevalent in the medieval times. The genre that was influencing the literary creativity the most that time was poetry. Among the major pre-romantic writers, or poets especially, James Thomson, Thomas Gray, William Cowper, William Blake, and Robert Burns are very celebrated poets. Now, let us have a quick look at these poets, who are also known as the precursors of Romanticism. So the first in the list is James Thomson, who lived between 1700 and 1748. He was a contemporary to Pope, but his literary work, The Seasons, which came out in 4 parts in different years, distinguishes him from his contemporaries. It was a series of nature poems. The series was divided into 4 parts, each detailing a different season, namely winter, summer, spring, and autumn. This work influenced and stimulated the later poets to a great extent. Some critics claim this work of Thomson to be the pioneering work that sparked the flare of Romanticism in the later poets. The 4 parts of the poem came out as different volumes. The first of these volumes was Winter, that came out in 1726, and the other parts were published in the subsequent years, and thus the complete poem came out in 1730. Next in line is Thomas Gray, who is the most celebrated of the genre that is known as graveyard poetry. The graveyard school of poetry represented the gloomy themes of death and despair. Gray's masterpiece, The Elegy Written in the Country Churchyard, is the perfect example of this poetry. Similar to Gray, Edward Young also was a famous graveyard poet whose Night Thoughts is another popular poem of this genre of poetry. Mysticism and sublimity were also a part of the pre-Romanticism, and William Blake's poetry represents this to a great extent. His poem, The Tiger, that begins with the famous line, "Tiger, tiger, burning bright," and another poem, Little Lamb, that begins with "Little Lamb, who made thee," are the widely read poems. The poems are basically the parts of songs of innocence that came out in 1789, and another volume, Songs of Experience, that came out in 1794, which are his most remarkable works as well. Painter by profession, Blake's artistic expression in poetry greatly challenged the existing traditional rules of the time. Another important poet was William Cowper, who also played an important role in shaping the Romantic era. His poem, The Task, epitomizes new sensibility and subjectivity. Further, the Scottish poet Robert Burns is also a prominent precursor of Romanticism, whose work, poems chiefly in the Scottish dialect, that came out in 1786, manifests his interest in folk lyrics and ballads. The picturesque landscape and the country life that he portrayed in this book influenced several writers of the time. Thomas Percy's Relics of Ancient English Poetry, which was also a collection of ballads, and Macpherson's The Poems of Ossian are also considered among the representative works of the age. Similarly, William Collins, Thomas Parnell, Crabbe, Joseph Warton, and several others like them contributed to laying of the foundation of the literary movement, what is known as Romanticism. And hence, they are known as the transition poets or the pre-romantic poets. Now, let us see how Romanticism actually began. Now, let us see how the period of Romantic era actually began in literature. Amidst the socio-political milieu of the time and influenced by the revolutionary and creative ideas of the transition poets or the precursors of the Romanticism, William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge in 1798 came up with a book titled Lyrical Ballads, which marks the actual beginning of the Romantic era in literature, especially in English literature. The intellectual and cultural movement, that is Romanticism, that began in 1798 came to an end with a political shift in Britain, which was the accession of Queen Victoria in 1837. Though some scholars believe that the Romantic era continued to have its influence on England till 1850, which was the same year when Wordsworth also died. But we believe that 1837 marks the Victorian era, the beginning of Victorian era. Lyrical ballads was a revolutionary work in itself, as it presented to literature a different kind of liberation. Personal emotions through simple diction, depiction of wild nature and imagination were the markers of the poetry in this book. Lyrical ballads thus became a representative of the romantic spirit. It also introduced the idea of sublime and spirituality in a different way. It begins with Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner and ends with Wordsworth's lines composed about Tintern Abbey. In the year 1800, the second edition of the book Lyrical Ballads appeared, with a preface in it written by William Wordsworth, who explained his philosophy of poetry in this book. According to him, in his poetry, he chose the incidents and situations from common life, and thus he tried to make them relatable by describing them in a language actually used by common men. This was his theory of poetry. He chose humble and rustic life along with the nature to express himself more naturally and freely. So, this was about the book. Now, let us discuss the poets who wrote lyrical ballads. Samuel Taylor Coleridge and William Wordsworth wrote this seminal book and revolted against the traditional style of writing. They are considered among the senior or the first generation romantic poets of the era. So, before moving on to the details of these two and also of other romantic writers, I would like to first discuss the distinction between the senior and the younger poets. And the introduction of the two poets will be followed by the other significant writers of the era. Romantic poets, to ease out the distinction, scholars and critics have distinguished the poets of Romantic era into two categories. The first generation poets or the senior poets and the second generation poets, that is the younger poets. Besides Wordsworth and Coleridge, some scholars believe William Blake also to be a part of first generation poets, whereas some tag Blake as a pre-romantic poet and include Southey with Coleridge and Wordsworth in it. However, in this lecture, we shall go with the latter classification as we have already discussed William Blake in the pre-romantics. So, as the first generation poets, we will be discussing Wordsworth, Coleridge and Southey, who were also called together the Lake Poets. Since all the three poets belong to the Lake District of England, therefore they are known as the Lake Poets. Whereas in the next category, that is the second generation romantic poets, we include Shelley, Byron and Keats. The poetry of Shelley and Byron was called the Satanic School of Poetry. The term Satanic School of Poetry was coined by Southey for these two writers. Let me now introduce you to the major poets of the era, or the first generation poets of the period first. As a disclaimer, I wish to inform you all that we shall discuss them very briefly here, and only the highlights of their literary endeavors will be discussed here. Since the detailed overview of the poets will be discussed and deliberated upon in the coming lectures of the impending 4 units of the syllabus. So, here, first in the list is William Wordsworth. He was born in 1770 in Cumberland, Cockermouth in the Lake District. William Wordsworth was one of the central figures of Romanticism. He studied at Cambridge University. He was greatly influenced by the French Revolution, and therefore he made a walking tour to France, but later in time he got very disillusioned with the revolution, and his disappointment in it made him go into depression. He was associated with Coleridge, and lyrical ballads was the result of this association with him. Wordsworth was appointed as the Poet Laureate in 1843 after Southey. He is famous as the greatest nature poet of England. For him, nature was not mere physical loveliness, but a revelation of God. He was a worshipper of nature, so the mystical love of nature is the most distinctive characteristic of his poetry. He was filled with despair after he saw the decline of the revolutions around. But he found solace in nature and realized that nature was also a great healer and soother. So therefore, he is also called a pantheist and a mystic for his extraordinary love for nature. His famous works include Prelude, which is his poetic autobiography, Lucy poems, Tintern Abbey, his famous preface to lyrical ballads, and Intimations of Immortality, and many others are on the list. Next in line after William Wordsworth is Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who was born in 1772. Similar to Wordsworth, he was also influenced by the French Revolution. But soon, similar to him, was disillusioned by it. He was a poet, philosopher, and a great critic. He is regarded as the high priest of romanticism for his mystical and imaginative writings. His poetry was full of supernaturalism, medievalism, dream visuals, mystery, and imagination. Kubla Khan and the Rime of Ancient Mariner are the major poetic works of Coleridge. Next is Robert Southey. Robert Southey was born in 1774. Today, his literary merit is not as acclaimed as is of his contemporaries, but his contributions cannot be neglected here. Together with Coleridge, he published The Fall of Robespierre. It was the first collection of his poems. In 1813, he was appointed as Poet Laureate of England. Like the other two, he also started as a revolutionary, but he ended being a conventional and conservative person. He is famous for writing epic poems, and among these, Thalaba, the Destroyer, The Curse of Kehama, and Joan of Arc are the most famous of these epic poems. Now, when we talk about the first generation poets, we cannot forget Walter Scott. So Scott was born in 1771. Though he was Scottish, his works are considered classics in both Scottish and English. He was a novelist, poet, playwright, and historian. His narrative romance, The Lay of the Last Minstrel, which came out in 1805, is one of the most significant works of the time, along with The Lady of the Lake, which was a narrative poem. Waverley, Rob Roy, and Ivanhoe are his very famous novels. Now, moving on to the second generation writers, let us discuss Shelley, Byron, and Keats now. The second generation writers were born after the impact of French Revolution started diminishing. They were full of radical ideas. So first among them was Byron. Lord George Gordon Byron, who born in 1788 and died in 1824, he was an aristocrat, and commercially he was the most successful among his contemporaries. His comic epic Don Juan and Childe Harold's Pilgrimage were his most famous works. Most of his protagonists share peculiar traits, some of which are inspired by Byron's own life. This set of traits initiated a different cult of its own, which came to be known as Byronism. And a Byronic hero is mostly a rebel and a wanderer who rejects the social norms and the social institutions, just like Byron. He is full of passions and has a hedonistic approach for life. So all these traits one can find in Byron's own life as well. Second in line is Percy Bysshe Shelley, who lived from 1792 to 1822 and was closely associated with Byron. Shelley is considered as the most lyrical of the Romantic poets. He is known for his unconventional life and unending idealism. Like Byron, he was also rebellious and rejected social conventions. His poetry is full of lyricism and Platonism. Melancholy and optimism are also the major traits of his poetry. Then comes John Keats. The youngest of the Romantic writers was John Keats. Keats was born in 1795 and died very young in 1821. Pursuit of beauty and love for nature are the most prominent themes of his poetry. His poetry is known for its picturesque elements and for the influence of Greek and medieval literature. He is famous for his odes, and Ode to a Nightingale, Ode on a Grecian Urn, and Ode to Autumn are among the most famous odes of his. And besides these, Lamia, Hyperion, and Endymion are also the very popular works of John Keats. Besides poetry, other genres like novels and essays also were very prominent in this time. Jane Austen, Walter Scott, Mary Shelley were the famous novelists of the time, and writers like Charles Lamb, Hazlitt, De Quincey, and Leigh Hunt were among the major prose writers and essayists. So now, let us come to the conclusion. To conclude, we can say that the time, which is also called by some critics as the Renaissance of wonder, that is Romanticism, marked a paradigm shift in the literary history, and we can very well trace out certain characteristics of Romantic literature after the discussion we have already made here. Romanticism was a celebration of nature. The Romantic poets saw nature as inspiring and healing. Nature was seen as something pure and a source of the renewal of soul. They found it a spiritual escape from the degradation of the society after the revolutions and the constantly increasing urbanization and industrialization. Nature for them had a power to make them experience sublimity. They were all awestruck with nature and its beauty. According to them, it was a manifestation of divinity, so it should not be treated objectively. Likewise, they also found a similar solace in the rustic life and the rural landscape. There, they could enjoy isolation in true sense and found it to be their refuge from the insane urban and industrial development. The rural life was closest to the roots. Therefore, besides nature, they moved to the pastoral pastures for solitude. This made their interest in common men and their language also quite apparent. Also, influenced by all this, the literary forms like ballads, lyrics, and romances also were revived by these writers. In the same vein, the sophistication of words and meter of the earlier era was also rejected by the Romantics, since the rules made the poetry a mechanical process according to them, whereas for these writers it was a spontaneous overflow of emotions, and thus it gave thrust to emotion over reason and intellect. So all this brought in imagination, fancy, aestheticism together in literature. Another major characteristic of Romanticism was its liberalism. The liberalism in manner, content and expression of writing, and moreover in the overall attitude towards life. It was observed, and thus subsequently it gave way to individualism too. Although it is not possible to discuss the Romantic period with all its backdrop exhaustively in this short time, but here we have tried to cover the major points and the salient features of the era. So here we put an end to the discussion of Romantic period. I hope it was easy to follow for you. Thank you for your patient listening.